We live in a time where information is everywhere. News, opinions, headlines, notifications, they're all designed to compete for our attention. And somehow, even with all of that, truth feels harder to find than ever. Not because truth no longer exists, because it's filtered, framed, softened, and sometimes avoided altogether. Seeking veracity isn't about being louder than everyone else. It is about chasing controversy or telling people what to think. It's about slowing down, asking better questions, being honest about what we know, what we don't, and what we're not being shown. In a world that rewards speed and certainty, this podcast exists to make space for something else: clarity, discernment, and truth that isn't rushed. This is episode 1 of the Seeking Veracity Podcast: Why Seeking Veracity Exists. If you're listening to this, I want to be clear about something from the start. I'm not here because I think I have everything figured out. I'm not claiming authority, and I'm not positioning myself as the final word on anything. I started seeking veracity because over time, something began to feel off. I've spent years observing media, narratives, and the way stories are framed. Not just what's said, but what's emphasized, what's repeated, and what's quietly disappears. My morning routine used to be to wake up, make my coffee, turn on the news, and check out stocks daily. The more I paid attention, though, the more I noticed patterns in both. Not always lies, but omissions. Not always deception, but silence. I didn't wake up one day angry or looking for a fight. Well, I wasn't looking for a fight, but I definitely felt indignation. I woke up uneasy, and that unease stayed. I wrote an article recently that laid out the purpose behind seeking veracity, but writing alone doesn't feel like enough. Conversations matter. Context matters, and sometimes truth requires more space than a headline or a paragraph allows. This podcast exists because I believe asking careful questions still matters. Discernment hasn't lost its value, even if it's no longer rewarded. Truth deserves to be pursued with humility, patience, and honesty, not certainty for the sake of comfort. I don't expect everyone to agree with me. In fact, disagreement is part of the process. What I do hope is that even when we disagree, we can do so thoughtfully, without dismissing questions simply because they're inconvenient. That's the foundation this podcast is built on. The word veracity is not used very often anymore. At its most basic level, veracity means conformity to truth. It means accuracy, honesty, and faithfulness to what is real. Veracity is not an opinion. It is not a preference either. And it is not whatever aligns most comfortably with what we already believe. To me, veracity is a commitment to truth, even when that truth is incomplete, uncomfortable, or still unfolding. In today's culture, certainty is rewarded far more than honesty. Saying, "I'm sure," is easier than saying, "I don't know yet." But seeking veracity means being willing to slow down and admit when answers are not fully formed. Veracity requires humility, the humility to admit when we are wrong, the humility to revise conclusions when new information comes to light, the humility to listen rather than immediately react. It also requires patience. Truth rarely fits neatly into sound bites or viral clips. It takes time to understand context, motive, history, and consequence. That kind of patience is not encouraged in a system built on speed and engagement. Seeking veracity does not mean distrusting everything. It means questioning carefully. It means recognizing that truth can exist alongside uncertainty, and that not every question needs an immediate answer. At its core, veracity is about integrity. It is choosing to pursue what is true over what is convenient, popular, or emotionally satisfying. That is the standard this podcast is aiming for. Not perfection, but integrity in the pursuit of truth. So, the question then becomes, why now? Why start a podcast like this in the middle of an information age where content is constant and opinions are endless? I mean, why wait this long? The answer is not because there is a lack of information. Quite frankly, it's because there is a lack of clarity. Information age? No, I disagree. It's the disinformation age. We live in a system that rewards speed over accuracy, reaction over reflection, and certainty over honesty. We live with trend watchers, information spreading with no sourcing, and in a world that is slowly merging with digital reality. Stories move quickly, narratives solidify fast, and once they do, questioning them becomes often uncomfortable or even unacceptable, sometimes punishable. Algorithms amplify what provokes emotion. Outrage travels faster than restraint, and fear spreads more easily than context. And in that environment, careful thinking is not encouraged, it's crowded out. Another issue is silence. Not every distortion comes from false reporting. Some come from what is left unspoken. Stories that do not fit cleanly into preferred narrative receive less attention, less follow up, or none at all. The silent majority. Over time, that silence shapes perception just as headlines do. When everyone is speaking at once, silence is often mistaken for neutrality. But silence is not neutral. It directs attention. It signals what matters and what does not. This creates a culture where people are not necessarily misinformed, but selectively informed. When information is selective, understanding and reality becomes fragile. This podcast exists because clarity still matters. Discernment still matters. Truth, even when it is inconvenient or complex, is worth the time it takes to pursue. Seeking veracity is not a reaction to one story or one event or one moment. It is a response to a pattern of noise without depth or passion, information without wisdom, and speed without reflection. Before we close today, I want to be clear about what this podcast is and what it is not. I'm a very open-minded person myself, so I really want to hear what you have to say. This podcast is a space for curiosity. It is a space for reflection, a space for asking questions and thinking critically about the information we receive. It is grounded in honesty, integrity, and patience. It is built to explore truth, a place where uncertainty is acknowledged and careful reasoning is valued. What this podcast is not is just as important. It is not a space for outrage, anger, judgment, or spectacle. It is not a platform for spreading claims without evidence or for promoting certainty over honesty. It is not partisan, and it is not a place for debates that are designed to divide rather than enlighten. The goal is not to convince anyone to agree with me either. The goal is to model thoughtful inquiry, to recognize patterns that shape our understanding, and to encourage discernment in the way we consume information. Disagreement is welcome. In fact, it is part of the process. What is not welcome is rushing to conclusions, dismissing questions, or replacing inquiry with certainty because it feels easier or safer. By defining what this podcast is and what it is not, the hope is that listeners can engage with it clearly, without confusion or misinterpretation. This foundation allows us to explore topics thoughtfully in future episodes. I want to leave you with one simple thought. This podcast is not asking you to agree with me. It is not asking you to take a side, perhaps in the long run, but not now. I'm just asking you to think, to pay attention, to notice what is said, and most importantly, what is not said. If you are someone who still believes that truth matters, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it takes patience to uncover, then you are in the right place. In future episodes, we will explore stories that have been overlooked, narratives that need context, and patterns that shape the way we understand the world. We will examine questions that are rarely asked and perspectives that are often ignored. This is a space for curiosity, discernment, and honest reflection. I hope you will join me in the pursuit of veracity, wherever it may lead. So, I just want to say thank you for listening to this first episode of Seeking Veracity. I look forward to the journey ahead, and stay blessed as always.